Moving on to our second half of the Ancient Rome lecture. As a reminder, we have moved on from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. So this is the Colosseum, also known as the Flavian Amphitheater. You've probably seen images of this building before. It has become quite ubiquitous with representations of the city of Rome itself. It was this massive amphitheater to accommodate over 50,000 spectators. That's 50,000 spectators, which is a massive amount of people even by today's standards. So you can imagine that 2,000 years ago, this was an absolute spectacle. So this building was constructed to host these elaborate spectacles, mostly reenactments of famous battles, gladiator matches, fights with wild beasts, as well as executions. So the Romans were really into fighting and bloodshed. This was a really big part of their culture, so they oftentimes celebrated it by having these massive spectacles take place in these public places. So there's actually an area below the amphitheater which is visible today. I've actually been to the Colosseum. There's a little bit of reconstruction where the original floor um, used to be, and then these are the subterranean vaults that were places that the gladiators would typically get ready. It was also a place where the wild beasts would be kept before they were released out onto the main floor. When we look at the Colosseum, we can see that arches, barrel vaults, and groin vaults are used quite liberally. So there are 76 entrances to the Colosseum, and there's these tiers of arches that are leading up towards the top. Each of these levels has columns that are engaged into the surface. That means they're not weight bearing, they're just kind of like a decoration on the outside. And each of these tiers has different column capitals on them. There are also flagstaffs at the top of the Colosseum at one point in time, and they were actually used to support this canvas roof that would be pulled over the Colosseum and used as shade on hot days. If you've ever been to Rome in the summer, you know that it gets very hot, and this is all made of stone, so you can imagine, again, very, very hot. So there was actually this massive, like, structure called the Valerium that would start off in the middle right here. It was like a ring of string, and then they would have all of these long vertical sails that would reach out towards the center, and there were members of the Roman Navy that would sit by here and actually um, like pull the sails out to cover the amphitheater. So the Colosseum was once faced in marble. A lot of it was removed and recycled during the Middle Ages. This tends to happen with a lot of older buildings that are faced in nice material. People just show up and they're like, this is nice marble, I guess I'll take it. So that's why it's in such a state of apparent disrepair, is that people were coming in and taking pieces of the marble away. So this is an artist rendition of the Colosseum in its full glory. We can see that it's this massive oval structure, and it was intended to be like a full height on all sides. This is an example of the Valerium right here. So there's all these strings going towards the center, and these are the sails that would be pulled over the people who were seated. In each of these archways, there were plenty of statues of gods and goddesses from the Roman Pantheon. There were also lots of sculptures of Roman emperors that were deified. So here is another rendition of the Colosseum. I included this diagram specifically to show a cutaway of the Colosseum. You'll notice that it's not completely solid all the way through. We have a kind of Swiss cheese model that is being used here that's creating these large interior spaces. So remember that barrel vaults are what happen when you take an arch and you stretch it into a tunnel. And then a groin vault is when you have two barrel vaults and you're intersecting them. So basically the entire foundations of the Colosseum are built on these like intersecting barrel vaults. So this is a video that was made by the History Channel a couple of years ago. Oh, I guess it doesn't play anymore. But it was talking about how the Colosseum was funded primarily by war booty that was seized from the sacking of Jerusalem, and how a lot of the people that they had conquered were actually forced to construct the Colosseum itself, which is why it was built so quickly. So this massive structure only took 8 years to build, and it was because it was built on the back of slave labor. This video also talks a little bit about the different kinds of things that would happen as spectacles inside of the Colosseum. Again, the Romans were quite eager to watch people being killed en masse. People would oftentimes bring their children and their wives to the event to watch this spectacle. It was like primetime television. Next work is the Forum of Trajan. So Trajan was Rome's emperor from 98 to 117 CE, and he's basically credited with being Rome's most prolific, successful, and well-liked emperors. So he basically expanded the Roman Empire to its greatest extent, and he was very much revered by the people for that. So this complex was intended to show Rome's stability, power, and might over everything else. It was a location where there were public spaces for gathering, so this is called a forum. There were also civic buildings like the Basilica Ulpia, and there were plenty of libraries too. So this was a place where knowledge was kept. There was a library with texts that were in the Greek language, and then was a library of texts in the Roman language. So this is indicating again that strong influence that ancient Greece is having on the culture and art of ancient Rome. We also have this similar structure that we saw in ancient Greece. We called it the, not the forum, we called it the agora, right? Remember the agora, this large civic space that is being placed in the center of a city. So this is serving a similar purpose to the Greek agora, right? So this particular forum right here was actually one of several within this section of Rome. There's kind of a funny story behind this. Basically, Trajan wanted to build his forum on top of the other emperor's fora, but they wouldn't let him. So there was this like 100-foot tall hill that was in the way of building this one. So he just basically told the architect Apollodorus, like, move the hill out of the way. So they did. So that's the kind of person that Trajan was. If something was in his way, he would just move it to the other side. So one of the hallmark features of the Forum of Trajan was the Column of Trajan, which we can see peeking out right here in this reconstruction. We're going to be talking about this in just a moment. Another common feature of ancient Roman fora was the use of the equestrian statue. So an equestrian statue is basically an image of the person that is being honored that's riding a horse. Oftentimes the horse is shown like slightly smaller than real life to basically emphasize the scale of the figure, and that is kind of a demonstration of hierarchy of scale. So we had the central plaza, and then we also had this surrounding complex of buildings, including the Basilica Ulpia. So the basilica would basically serve as the foundation for the Christian cruciform church in later centuries, and then we also had a set of markets on the side here. So here's the main square, or the plaza. And this is a digital reconstruction. There's not much of the Basilica Ulpia left. There are a couple of columns left, but this is what it originally looked like here. It was this massive columned interior space, usually used to hold law courts. There are some human figures in here for scale. You'll notice that it had 2 floors and had these walkways on either side. So there was also this massive roof that was 80 feet across, made of timber, that spanned the top of the building to create an enclosed interior space. These are what remain of the markets of Trajan. We're again seeing that similar kind of structure that we saw with the Colosseum, where we're having these repeated barrel and groin vaults that are arranged in a more or less circular pattern. Similarly to the Colosseum as well, the base of the building was made of concrete and then it was faced in something that was a little bit prettier. In this case, it was faced with brick. This right here is the Column of Trajan. This was the commemorative narrative that was basically the centerpiece of this entire forum. It was also his place of burial, so his ashes were placed in the base after he died. So the column is actually made out of hollow marble, and there's an interior spiral staircase that leads all the way to the top of the column. Wrapped around the column is this 625-foot long frieze that wraps around and is basically telling the narrative of Trajan's defeat of the Dacians. So the Dacians were basically the people that occupy what is now Romania. So remember that the Romans are really into conquering other people, and they see it as a thing to celebrate when they do so. So one of the things that actually funded the Forum of Trajan itself was the conquest of the Dacians and taking all of their stuff and all of your people and forcing them to build new stuff. So there's over 200 or 2,500 figures carved in low relief into this narrative frieze in 150 different scenes. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and it's difficult to tell exactly what's happening in this image. There was also a statue of Trajan on top originally. It was eventually replaced with a statue of St. Peter when the Catholic Church started gaining power and influence in ancient Rome. So this is a great little video that was produced by National Geographic a couple of years ago that uses claymation to demonstrate the construction of the Column of Trajan.
In the heart of Rome lies a mystery. Trajan's Column is one of the most impressive monuments to survive the fall of the Roman Empire, and researchers are still trying to understand how it was actually built. If only we could go back in time, we could watch this amazing feat of engineering come together. The column was dedicated by the Roman Senate in 113 AD to honor the Emperor Trajan, who had just conquered the Dacians, all but wiping them from the face of Europe. The architect was thought to be Apollodorus of Damascus, who had already designed Trajan's Forum. At 126 feet tall, the column would require 29 blocks of solid marble, each weighing from 25 to 77 tons. These were brought from a quarry north of Rome and floated up the Tiber River to the work site. Within each drum was carved windows and a staircase, allowing access to the top. A current theory says the drums were rolled into the base of a lifting tower, a sophisticated scaffolding and pulley system for lifting the drums high into the air. To grip the drums, slots were carved into the marble for Lewis irons, which held the marble from the inside. Then ropes were attached to each Lewis. Providing the power for lifting the drums was a series of capstans working in concert, each pushed by perhaps a dozen men as well as horses. These were connected to ropes that wound through pulley blocks up and down the lifting tower. In this way, a marble drum could be raised high above the streets below. To see what's happening inside the lifting tower, let's take away one of the outer walls of this model. A drum is lifted and then lowered onto a trundling platform. Ropes are disconnected and the drum is moved horizontally. Then, new ropes are attached. The platform is removed and the drum is lowered and secured into place. Once the drums are set, craftsmen smooth the surface and begin work on a 656-foot-long frieze, which tells the story of Emperor Trajan's war victory. The frieze spirals up the column like a giant comic strip in 155 different scenes, and was probably painted with bright colors. No evidence remains as to what the colors actually were. A bronze statue of Trajan was placed on top, but in 1588 a pope installed a statue of St. Peter instead. The statue of Trajan has been lost to history. Meanwhile, the pedestal is made out of 8 marble blocks and contains the tomb of Trajan. Trajan's Column has stood for more than 1900 years and was deeply influential. Over the centuries, as the city's landmarks crumbled, the column has continued to fascinate and inspire.
That's one of my favorite videos that I show during the school year. I think it's so charming. All right, moving on to our next piece. This is the Pantheon. So you might recall in our ancient Greece lecture that we had a work that was similar in name called the Parthenon with an R. So remember that the Parthenon and the Pantheon are different buildings from different civilizations, okay? So the Pantheon, like its name suggests, was a monument intended to honor all of the gods, as well as a couple of deified emperors as well. So when you break down the roots of the word Pantheon, so pan means all, and then theos or theon means God. So basically the building's literal name is all gods. There's also an inscription across the frieze at the entrance of the building that translates to Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, consul thrice, built, which is intended to represent commissioned it. So this is actually the second building in this location. Marcus Agrippa commissioned the first Pantheon, but apparently Emperor Hadrian didn't find it impressive enough, so he replaced it around 125 CE and oftentimes actually held court inside of the building. When you look at this building, you'll notice that there's a lot of elements of it that are very, very similar to Greek architecture. We have a triangular pediment, as well as a frieze and an architrave and Corinthian columns right here. So the facade is very, very Greek in nature, and that was intentional. You have to remember that the Romans were very much influenced by the Greeks and their culture and architecture. On the inside, however, is something that's a little bit more Roman, and that involves the dome. All right? So this dome was this massive, I believe, 47-meter diameter hemisphere that was located on the inside of this building. A couple of things about it. So this dome at the base had walls that were around 20 feet thick. The thickness decreases with height as you go taller in the dome, and the materials are actually lighter towards the top. So you'll notice at the base here it's a lot thicker, and then as you move towards the top, the building is getting thinner. Interestingly, the materials that were used in the concrete to build the Pantheon were actually differed in composition based on how high you went up. So the stuff at the bottom, for example, had a lot of travertine in it, which is a very durable stone, whereas this, the concrete at the top actually used pumice. So those of you who have heard this word pumice before, you've probably used a pumice stone to get rid of dead skin on the heels of your feet. It's this fabulous volcanic stone that is very light and it's porous and it actually floats. So the lightest kind of stone is used towards the top, whereas the heavier, more durable stuff is used towards the bottom. All right, so one of the things that you'll notice about this dome is that it has a hole in the top. So this is called the oculus. So oculus is Latin for eye. And this oculus, it was intended to serve several functions. One, it was to let light inside of the building. Remember that this dome doesn't really have exterior windows except for these tiny little windows on the side here. So this is the primary light source inside of the building. What's super cool is that it also actually functions as a sundial, so you can actually tell the time by the position of the light spot inside of the building. It also allowed air to flood the space. So the Pantheon is one of the best preserved buildings from ancient Rome. One of the reasons that it was so well preserved is that it was used by the Catholic Church for services, so they kept it really nice. This building is extremely brilliantly and ornately decorated. We have tiled floors using different kinds of colored marble. The ceiling was painted at one point in time. There were these little niches here for statues of gods. We don't really know what happened to them. And inside of the coffers, which are these squares that are on the inside of the dome right here, there used to be these little brass attachments that were kind of shaped like flowers that were placed within. So these coffers were basically these concentric squares that were intended to reduce the amount of material that was being used in the dome. Remember that there's no steel or any sort of other material that is being used to reinforce this concrete, so they really need to rely on the integrity of the material and not having it be so heavy. And one of the ways that they do that is by cutting out some of the material. So you can kind of see in this cross section here how some of the material has been removed. So the Pantheon would actually go on to influence lots of artists and architects during the Italian Renaissance. One of the things that we're going to be seeing in the next unit is that artists and architects kind of forget about domes and they forget how to do them for a couple of hundred years. And it's during the Renaissance that people start to figure this out again and really have a newfound appreciation for the Pantheon. It was a place of such significance and importance in ancient Rome, actually, that there are several Italian kings buried there, as well as the Italian Renaissance artist Raphael. So this is the interior of the Pantheon. You can notice that there's lots of different colors of marble that are being used inside of the building. We're seeing that continued theme of pediments across these rectangular spaces, as well as Corinthian columns here. Another thing you'll notice is this repeating motif of circles, squares, and rectangles throughout. So this is really intended to create a sense of visual harmony. When you look at the plan and elevation for the Pantheon as well, you're noticing, like, even within like the broader general structure of the Pantheon, we have this perfect circle that is defining this interior space right here. So this is a good piece to actually compare to the Parthenon, ironically, because there's this sense of like visual harmony and math and monumental architecture. Our last piece of the unit is the Ludovisi Battlesarcophagus. So this sarcophagus is actually named based off of one of the former owners of the sarcophagus. We don't actually know who it was used to bury. What you'll notice when you look at the Battlesarcophagus is an extremely crowded composition. There are several dozen figures here in a relatively smaller space. So whenever we see a composition that has lots of stuff going on and it's very crowded and there's not really any empty space to be seen, that's called horror vacui. We're going to be seeing this term pretty frequently in art history. So horror vacui in Latin means fear of emptiness. So fear of like the absence of something. So these figures are quite literally piled on top of each other in these ways that are not really naturally possible. This was intended probably by the artist to emulate the confusion and the chaos of battle. So we're seeing members of the Roman army in this piece. They're along the top portion of the Battlesarcophagus. They're pretty recognizable because most of them are wearing helmets and armor. They're also mostly clean shaven, and by and large they're the ones that are faring better than the people that they are conquering on the bottom, who are likely barbarians or other people that the Romans are conquering and then subjugating. So remember, again, the Romans love conquering people. It's a subject that they visit over and over again in their art. So there's this dehumanization that is actually happening in this piece. We have this glorification of the victors. They're obviously like doing pretty well for themselves. They're very victorious. We even have this central figure that is raising his arm in a gesture that's very similar to the one that we're seeing on the Augustus of Prima Porta, this orator's gesture. And he's not even wearing a helmet, so he's pretty cocky. And in a sense, he's intended to portray this youth that is invincible. He's also very large for his horse, which is a common like design motif that happens in ancient Rome, as we saw with other artworks. So one of the other things that you'll notice about the Ludovisi Battlesarcophagus is that the figures are not oftentimes well proportioned or abide by a consistent rule of perspective. So when we look at this figure, for example, his arm is quite large for the size of his head. So this is also adding to the sense of confusion and also indicating to art historians that there's something happening during this period that is putting enough stress on artists that there might be some sort of like general anxiety of the time. So at this point in time, we're entering the late imperial period of the Roman Empire. We've passed the zenith of Trajan, and things are starting to go downhill. So this is when we're starting to see this building sense of premonition and anxiety in art. So at this point in time, Rome is kind of struggling to maintain its upper hand and trying the best that it can to maintain a hold of its assets. A couple of other things too. This is a really large piece of marble. That and the intricacy of the carving, the amount of detail that the artist was able to get in this very high relief sculpture indicates that whoever commissioned this was probably very wealthy. Also, the figures along the bottom are slightly smaller than the figures along the top. This is another example of hierarchy of scale, albeit a little bit more subtle than other examples that we've seen. It's also creating this, this visual illusion that we're looking down upon the figures. So this is, again, very reflective of this Roman mentality of we are the best and everybody else is basically going to be conquered by us because they're inferior to us. All right, that concludes Unit 2.